Hello, welcome to the panel on the interplay of official statistics and privacy. This panel addresses the growing tension between obtaining the necessary statistics needed by business and government and all Canadians to make informed decisions and policies on one hand, and the privacy of individuals and organizations on the other hand. In discussing privacy, we consider three dimensions: the right to not disclose information about oneself, the right to control how one's information is used, and the right to be left alone. Before we start, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves. I'm Don Estep, I'm the moderator. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Computational Probability and Uncertainty Quantification in the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science at Simon Fraser University. I'm also the director of the Canadian Statistical Sciences Institute, or CANSI, which is sponsoring this panel. CANSI is the National Institute dedicated to supporting research in statistical sciences across Canada. It is funded by NSERC. John, could you introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm John Abowd, the Associate Director for Research and Methodology and Chief Scientist at the United States Census Bureau. My academic background is in economics and statistics. I've been at the Census Bureau full-time since June of 2016. Among my duties are as the Chief Methodologist to oversee the confidentiality protection procedures that are used by the Census Bureau and all of its data products. In that capacity, I'm supervising the implementation of the privacy protection system for the 2020 Census of Population, which will use differential privacy as its primary tool. I'm delighted to be here today. I look forward to a vigorous conversation with the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Anne-Sophie, could you go next?
Yes. Hi, my name is Anne-Sophie Charest. I'm a professor of statistics at Université Laval in Quebec City. And my expertise in research is on privacy for statistical databases. So I work on different ways of measuring risk for such data, and also on creating synthetic data sets, which are sort of made up data that you create in order to share with other people while protecting the privacy of the respondents.
Thank you. Amanda, could you go next?
Thanks, Don. So I'm Amanda Edmunds. I'm the Director for Compliance with the Privacy Act at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. I've been working in this field for nearly a decade. One thing I'll note that I don't have, which many of my colleagues have, is I do not have a degree in privacy, because when I was in school, that was not a thing. It is now, because the world is changing. But I'm not dating myself very much by saying that I don't have that, because the world is quite rapidly changing when it comes to how privacy and data interact. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Amanda. And finally, Eric, could you go?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Rancourt. I'm the Director General of Modern Statistical Methods and Data Science branch at Statistics Canada. This is the area where we look after the methodology and the methods and the procedures for all statistical programs. And that includes the development and implementation of methods and techniques related to ensuring privacy and protecting confidentiality, so all the confidentiality measures. And I'm also the Principal Data Ethics and Scientific Integrity Officer. I've been at StatCan for 30 years, and I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
All right, Eric, thank you very much. So we're going to begin the panel with very short statements by each panelist about the topic in general, and then we'll proceed to some questions. So I thought we could start with Anne-Sophie.
Okay. Well, I guess so. This discussion is about the interplay of official statistics and privacy. Personally, I've been working on privacy research, which is a bit more sort of outside of the frame of an agency, as I don't work for an agency. I've never worked for an agency, but I'm concerned about more the technical aspects of how we can talk and measure privacy from a more statistical point of view, which in my point of view, that's very important to be able to measure and use the correct words to talk about privacy if you want to then use it inside of a big organization where there are a lots of other goals apart from just protecting the privacy. So others will most probably talk about this, but there's the very important goal of making the data useful. And we also look at that from a statistical perspective, how we can measure utility of such data sets. But I guess my point of view is very focused on the different ways of measuring all the blocks that go into using official statistics in the best way possible for both the respondents and the agencies. And so I guess I don't have a very big statement on that, except that I think it's very important to make sure that we define exactly what we mean when we talk about various aspects. And I guess I'll try to include that in the discussion that follows.
Oh, great. Thank you. Eric, could you go next?
Yes, sure. Thank you. So the interplay between official statistics and privacy is ever present all the time in everything we do in the National Statistical Office. Essentially, what we do is there's data, and we gather, we guard, we grow the data in order to give information. So gather, guard, grow, give is what we do. And in all those steps, it is very important to have in mind both the importance of informing Canadians, informing citizens, depending on the country, and making sure that privacy is protected, because there's a foundational element of trust between the main stakeholders of a statistical system, who are the citizens, because information comes from the citizens in one way or another, either directly if it's surveys and statistical programs about people, but indirectly, but also from people when it's about businesses. And so that trust has to be maintained by ensuring that there's an adequate amount of information that comes back, but at the same time that the gathering, the guarding, and the growing is true to the confidence that people put in the National Statistical Office in giving us the data. So it's not, we try to produce stats despite privacy, or we try to protect privacy and we deal with the stats. It's both at the same time. And so this is a wonderful mathematical problem. It is also a wonderful societal and ethical problem, or challenge, not problem, but challenge. And this is what we do, a bunch of us, for a living, making sure that society is well informed, but at the same time, the information is well protected.
Oh, great. Thank you. Amanda, could you go next?
Thanks, Don. So what I'll say is, echoing a little bit of what Eric said, is that we live in an age of big data. Big processing power, information is currency. Like, there's so many possibilities, and the way that we all interact with that is changing. And this is really at the heart of both statistics and privacy. We're also in an age, sadly, of misinformation, of widely disseminated misinformation. So the work of official statistics has never been more important. I I've engaged enough with Statistics Canada to get a glimpse of some of the challenges facing official statistics. There's pressure to find new ways to use all of the massive volume of data that's now produced in this digital age. And there's other drivers like declining responses to surveys and rising costs. So that's the setting. And then, of course, there's also, these are challenging times on the privacy front too. For good and bad, all of these new data-driven technologies are a disruptive force. They promote innovation and growth and better government services informed by data-driven policies. But there's also harms to rights, including the right to privacy and the right to democracy. And we see in a lot of places eroding evidence of trust in public and private institutions in terms of privacy. This is something that, you know, increasingly is in the news. And I, in my role, one of the things that I've done for the past decade is review complaints that come in. So I have a strong sense of what people are concerned about. And they are concerned not just about how things will directly affect them. They are very concerned about that, but just who knows what about them. And lots of research has shown that surveillance in and of itself has an impact on people. So, and to paraphrase Canada's chief statistician, when it comes to this equation of trust, that without trust, official statisticians are unable to do their job. So getting privacy right is a big part of that equation. And today we get to talk about the nuts and bolts. How do you do that? How do you demonstrate to individuals that when you're choosing what to collect for official statistics, when you're choosing how to use it, when you're considering how it could be abused, you know, once it's out in the wider world, how do you protect against re-identification? These are all of the things. How do you make sure that people can see and feel that their privacy is protected and maintain this balance and this social equation of trust?
Oh, thank you, Amanda. And finally, John, could you say something?
Thank you, Don. Well, Eric is really my counterpart at Statistics Canada, and he very nicely summarized the problem that we face inside statistical agencies. In the United States, we have just about spent $15.6 billion to collect the 2020 census of population. So that's $15.6 billion for 330 million data points. You can do the division, and I'm pretty sure you will conclude that those are some pretty expensive bits. And they have some very high-profile uses. They divide up the seats in the House of Representatives. They allocate someplace between $675 million and $1.5 trillion of federal funds each year. And so it's important that the activity that underlies those official statistics be trusted by Americans and by people in the world in general. And so we operate under very tight statutory and judicial supervision, but under laws that were not conceived for the information age. They were conceived for, how do we say this charitably, a simpler time. And I'm looking to see if Eric smiles. Maybe that didn't quite do the trick, but Canadian laws are updated more often than American laws. The Census Act was written in 1954 and last materially modified in the 1990s. So other than the appropriation, we're really working under a statute that's 75 years old. It says that we have to protect confidentiality, and it says that in very clear, black and white, easy to understand language. The secretary can't publish anything that would reveal the respondent who supplied the information. That's essentially an exact quote from the statute. So with the benefit of modern mathematics, we know that the statute states a mathematical impossibility, which puts the Census Bureau and other statistical agencies between a rock and a hard place. And in fact, the rock has passed through the hard place, as was demonstrated in the early 2000s. The methods that statistical agencies have used to protect confidentiality are vulnerable to modern data science techniques. And the reason they're vulnerable is because they made assumptions about what the person who wished to use the data for evil could do that are no longer true. And as a consequence, those methods are vulnerable. They don't fail all the time. They don't even fail most of the time. But sometimes they fail spectacularly. And that is the case for the way the Census Bureau traditionally published results from its censuses. We basically published the microdata, and that's no longer something that the statistical agency can do for a population census. So it has to be fixed, and the methods that are available to fix it haven't been used at that scale before, even by tech companies. And the tech companies themselves have recognized that it's a monumental challenge to deliver something that is meaningful to the user of the data that meaningfully protects the privacy of the person who supplied it, even assuming all of the transactions that got you the data were voluntary. But you have to respond to the US Census, so that's not a voluntary transaction. You have to fill out your tax form, so statistics from tax forms are not based on voluntary collection of data. They're based on trust of the people filling in those forms that they will be properly handled and used for the purposes that they're intended for. So that's the problem we're all trying to address here. And at the moment, nobody has a good solution, a general purpose solution, but you can kind of tell what's wrong with the current technology. Imagine I'm Facebook and I say, these statistics that I prepared for your research, they're safe to use. I protected them with lots of special confidentiality protections, but I can't tell you what they are because that would break them. That's basically a lay translation of the method used to defend statistical disclosure limitation in most state agency products. Or alternatively, you're a journal editor and you send out a paper for a referee's report, and the author has said, I used confidential data, but I can't tell you how the confidentiality protections were applied, nor whether they affect the quality of my inferences, because the agency won't tell me what they did. Neither of those situations is acceptable in the information age. So we need to fix them, and that's what we're about. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Well, I think that's actually touching on the first question that we'll address. Confidentiality protection is often enshrined in legislation that does not recognize the trade-off between statistical precision and privacy loss. How has your agency or research developed policy or ideas to address this trade-off? And I'd like to start with Amanda on this question.
Thanks, Don. So I think one thing I'll start here is by saying that we absolutely see this. And of course, privacy intersects with lots of different important social goods. And so we often see this, and we see how historical legislation doesn't always reflect current reality. So for instance, some of the things that you were just speaking about, John, is the idea that when these kind of provisions were crafted in 1950s, let's say, what people were thinking about is the way that data could be used then. And so often this legislation sometimes it focuses, for instance, only on protecting against disclosure to the general public. But of course, privacy has always been more than that. But the power of technology has meant that previously it was very costly to collect information, and you'd have to perhaps rely on voluntary or mandatory survey forms. But now there's so many other options. So often the legislation doesn't reflect, for instance, the privacy loss can be affected by what is collected in the first place by a statistical agency. Even if they never reveal it at the end, there's still an impact on privacy because you're able to collect things perhaps without people's knowledge. Perhaps very sensitive things. And there's also how it's used and combined, because there's so much more ability to process that data. So often the legislation doesn't think about that element of privacy protection either. And these are, in addition to that traditional idea of protection from disclosure, very important concepts for people today. When they think about privacy, they're thinking about who knows what about me? What does the government know about me? As well as how could that be used downstream once it's put out there? So the idea of privacy, an old idea of privacy equating to secrecy, doesn't really work anymore. Really, a more helpful way to think about privacy is like control over information. People want to know how it's being used. They want to know that it's being used in ways that that make sense to them and that they would agree with, you know, in a fundamental way that our society agrees with. So that's something I'd encourage is when you think about it, think about privacy as a sort of a spectrum of control through a continuum. The other thing that's important to think about is, of course, privacy is a human right. The United Nations has said that privacy is a human right. The ability to live free from surveillance and with privacy is something that's sort of recognized across the globe. Now, of course, that's integrated in different ways in different countries. In Canada, when it comes to official statistics, you know, information collected by government, we have the Privacy Act, which enshrines confidentiality, but it also enshrines some exceptions. So another thing to think about that adds some nuance is that to protect privacy does not mean that you need to absolutely prevent any personal information from ever being at risk of re-identification. As John mentioned, we all know that that is an impossibility, an increasingly important impossibility. But fortunately, privacy is more nuanced than that, because like all rights, it's not absolute. You know, there's always nuances when it comes to protecting our fundamental rights. So it's a fundamental right. It's also, I call it a gateway right, because it's a right that helps protect other rights. But there's a way to address those. So coming back to the question about what do you do about that? What do you do about the fact that the legislation may not fully recognize privacy losses and may also set unrealistic expectations where it does address them, because nothing in this world is absolute in the age of data. So how do you address that? So one way is to call for change, is to continue to call for change in legislation to try to reflect the nuances of the modern world. But then another framework that's really important is an idea, is a tool that we feel can be applied to a lot of situations, which is necessity and proportionality. Is that you need to take a step back and you need to say, what am I trying to accomplish? What information do I need to collect? What's necessary for me to be able to deliver the social good? And making sure that it's proportional, that the impact on privacy is balanced with the social good. And that's really, I think, the way that you address how a right constrains legislation. Rights always constrain social goods. I mean, think about medical research. And think about law enforcement. You know, rights are major constraints on how we do those, and we are always trying to find that balance. And those constraints are an important part of our society. And the real challenge is, how do we make sure that there is that trust? And the idea of necessity and proportionality, of taking a balanced approach, gets you there, because it moves away from the idea of absolutes, of needing to absolutely protect information from any risk of re-identification without thinking about other privacy risks. And it moves you into a world of balancing and proportionality and saying, if I have a social good that's really important, and this is how evidence is going to help address that social good, then I can respect the privacy trade-offs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. Eric, could you respond to that?
Yes, thank you. So privacy is and confidentiality protection is in legislation. As you said, for instance, if we take the Statistics Act, there are clear statements about protecting confidentiality and measures like that. But also the Act has specifics about making sure that we consider appropriate methods and procedures, and that we use professional standards and so on. But rightly said in the question, it doesn't say how these two intertwine or how they interact. And this is the work that we have to do. And traditionally, we have focused the thinking and the work towards the end of the continuum. When I talked about gather, guard, grow, and give, in the give part, when we provide information to Canadians, to researchers, to different users, there's a wide array of tools and efforts that have been deployed to make sure that confidentiality, there's protection of confidentiality, and that there's no disclosure risk that is unmanageable. And so there are mathematical techniques, and there are different ways to do that, whether it be perturbation of the file by changing some of the values or rounding. There's been some work like Anne-Sophie is doing on synthetic data. But also it's about access. So if within the National Statistical Office we can have access to that data, then we can provide access to others. And that's why 20 years ago at Statistics Canada, we created some sort of data embassies that we call research data centers, where people who have passed the credentials can come in if they have a genuine project and that is well identified, and work within those research data centers. So in a way, they come within the shell and they have access to the data, but it's limited and controlled. Now with, like Amanda mentioned about the data proliferation and the data revolution, there's all kinds of options and possibilities for national statistical offices to enhance their capacity to respond to data needs in programs. So privacy protection needs to happen throughout the process, but also at the entrance. And so that's why we actually developed and adopted a framework along the lines of what Amanda described on necessity and proportionality, but also embedding it into the scientific approach so that it is true to the profession of statistician, and at the same time taking into account ethical issues, chiefly privacy protection, but also the sensitivity of the data, how people see what are their views and I would almost say preferences, social preference, not individual preferences, to seeing to it that the National Statistical Office gathers the appropriate information. And so what have we done? If we look at the question, well, there's the research data centers and different offering of solutions for access to the data. We have a policy on informing users of data quality and methodology, so we can state there what are the methods, the limits, and how the data was gathered and so on, thereby providing some more tools to the analysts. We are viewing the access at the end of the process in terms of the 5 safes of data protection. So not just the data itself, but the people, the project, and more facets. And we have adopted the necessity and proportionality framework, which is really, I would call it a convergence of different sciences, because it involves statistics, privacy, ethics, and even to some degree psychology, because it's about the data sensitivity. So it is no longer possible, though required, to look at it just from a statistical point of view, but it has to be the union of all those sciences. Thank you.
Oh, Eric, thank you very much. John, could you give us the Census Bureau perspective?
Well, thank you. I warned you all that my background was as an economist, but I want to preface my remark here by saying I learned most of this from a computer scientist named Kobe Nassim, who is one of the people who discovered the vulnerabilities of publishing data in the clear in the early 2000s. So curating data is an economic problem because in spite of the fact that there's a lot of it, a database is finite. Any database you show me has a fixed number of bits in it. So that is 100% of the information in that database. How do you want to use that information? Well, you can use it to produce statistics, information that people can use to make important decisions for other purposes. Or you can use it, in another sense, to protect their privacy, and not make it available for any use. Now, statistical agencies understand that there's no point in collecting data if you're not going to make some statistical publications from it. So perfect protection of privacy is not something that any statistical agency is in the business of doing. It's in the business of balancing the interests of the users of the data with the providers of the data. But that is not a technical problem. That's a social choice problem. Whose use interests get enough weight so that the data are created and put into the public domain for them, for that use? Whose privacy interests get enough weight so that data sufficient to compromise them are not put in the public domain? There's no textbook on that subject. There's no set of computer science algorithms that solve that problem. It's basically assigned to decision makers. In Eric's agency and in my agency, it's assigned to the senior executives of the agency to interpret the privacy laws and deliver statistics that meaningfully address the use cases and meaningfully protect the confidentiality of the data providers. So what we've done at the Census Bureau is we've taught the senior executives how to think about the trade-off, what it means to have a good algorithm for protecting confidentiality, and then what it means to choose features or parameters for that algorithm that do some things and not other things. So Don's going to wave his hand in a second, so I want to get the use case that really makes this hard out on the table. We use the census data to redraw every legislative district in the country, from Congress seats to the voting districts of the Chamber of Commerce for municipalities with 1,000 occupants, 1,000 residents. So that is an incredibly diverse set of legislative bodies, and it requires defining a pixel that is the smallest unit of people that you can move around in these legislative districts. And worse, I can't tell you the boundaries in advance because they're going to be set after you take the census data. They depend on who lives where and some of the properties of who lives there. So you need to deliver something where the pixels, in the United States, that's a city block. There are about 8 million of them with people in them. The pixels resolve to meaningful units of voters, and then the statistics about those units of voters need to be reasonably accurate. Well, if your voting district has 5 people in it, there's really no way for me to give you accurate statistics about those 5 people without essentially telling you who they are and what their characteristics are. If your district has, like a congressional district, about 970,000 people in it, then I can give you pretty detailed statistics about the average characteristic in that district without compromising much of the privacy. Right? Trying to get a set of statistics that has those pixels so they can be moved around and still produces reliable statistics for arbitrary districts is an extremely challenging use case for protecting privacy and for data accuracy.
Thank you, John. And finally, Anne-Sophie, could you respond?
Sure. Well, actually, some of the things that John was mentioning made me think a bit more about question 2. But I guess from my perspective, what's interesting here and very difficult is that, as was said, it's not just a technical problem. And that's something that I run into problems a lot when I deal with people that are not necessarily in agencies, but also companies. Companies have the same problem, right? They want to share some data with people and they want to make sure it protects privacy. And then they ask me, you know, how can I have a stamp of approval that even if I share this, I'll protect privacy? And then I have to go back to them and say, you know, like as statisticians, we work on specific definitions of what privacy means. So I may be trying to measure the probability of re-identifying someone in the data set, or I may be trying to measure how close of a guess I can have at some variable about you that's in the data set. But that will just be quantifying the risk. And in the end, it really is a question that cannot be decided by statistician. The person who has the data set, they will have to decide based on this trade-off between utility and privacy. They'll have to decide where is the limit, and it will depend on sometimes the mission of the organization, the legal requirements. It might depend on the kind of respondents that are in there, what they are comfortable with. But I think this is why this is very difficult. It's because it's not just compared to a bunch of other problems I've worked on in statistics where it's just really technical. You try to estimate something, there's a right answer, and you see if your methods get you there. Well, here you try to estimate some things, but the answer is not just technical. And so I think that's one of the difficulties here with that interplay between official statistics and privacy. And that's why I think it's important that not just statisticians understand these things, but or economists or other people that are more technical, but that you know, for the public, they need to be able to express their needs and understand the discussions. And I think that Amanda's discussion of privacy as a control mechanism, like control over what you share and how it's used, I think that really is an important part of how people feel about privacy, which is not something that we measure in the same fashion very technically. And so for example, sometimes, you know, I mean, that's probably happened to you. You are looking for something on the internet and you shop around for something, say you want to go on a trip, and then a little bit later, there's this pop-up offering you some discounts on some trip in the same location, right? Like the internet, they learn things about you. And now I sort of expect this to happen. I expect my computer to be sharing information to other people because of how I interact with websites. But would I expect that from a government agency? Would I expect that once I go and fill out a form somewhere on the internet for a government agency, I don't know, say I fill out something for unemployment, would I expect that the next day the government is sending me information on a totally different website about job opportunities? That's an example I've heard before from people thinking about that control. There's also this sort of understanding of what people will do with your statistic, and this is not in the laws, right? Like this question started with legislation, but rapidly we made it important that people trust statistical agencies. And so I think also part why this is difficult is that statistical agencies, they don't just have to follow the laws. They also have to make sure that people are comfortable with what they're doing. And that's hard from a statistical perspective because it's not, you know, easily measurable. And so that's why the discussion has to really include a lot of different users and just citizens also.
Thank you. Thank you, Emery. Before we go to the next question, does anyone have a response or an additional thought that came to them while they were listening? You've all answered your own questions. Well, we could move on to the next question. Privacy protection and utility of official statistics are closely related. Are there any situations where the utility of a statistical output trumps privacy protection. And I'd like to start with John on this one.
I was trying to read along, but the slide didn't say the same question you asked.
Oh,
it's okay. So, of course there are. However, you have to be really careful. I'm going to be as careful as I can be and hope that Amanda doesn't catch me in too many slip-ups. At least the statistical agencies with which I am familiar operate under a statistical use only mandate. And there actually is a recently passed law. The last law in the US that was passed was the 2018 Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which in its third title revised the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act to include a definition of non-statistical uses. I guess the lawyers assumed that it was binary, so if they defined non-statistical uses, then the rest of the universe would be statistical uses. So this is tricky because statistics are used to enforce laws all the time. And so you can't say that a non-statistical use is a law enforcement use because then you wouldn't be able to use the statistics to allocate money. That's a law enforcement, or to draw legislative districts. That's a law enforcement. What you have to do is you have to do something like the Europeans have tried to do, and say that the use can't be to single out someone for action by a law enforcement agency. So that's how you try to draw the line. You can't develop a statistical product that says you're violating the law. Here, I see this from the statistic that the US Census Bureau released about you. So you can describe the situation that is a non-statistical use, and it's got a nice, relatively clear statutory definition now. But it's still tricky. Because suppose I develop the predictor model for someone being in a non-compliant with tax law, for example. That predictor model is based on statistical analysis of data. We would consider the model itself a statistical use. You're doing a prediction, but the application of that prediction is to a singled out use. Statistical agencies really struggle with this distinction because it's almost impossible to define the boundary other than by example. And so the precision with which you can point a statistical model at a particular person is really what modern privacy protection tools are trying to control. If you control the ability of that model to predict specifically for a person, then you are protecting the confidentiality of that person's data, and you're also limiting the ability to use the statistic for a non-statistical purpose in a generic, mathematically well-defined way, but a way that it's going to struggle to find its way into statute. So that's kind of how we think about this problem and why it's so challenging, not just for statistical agencies. It's challenging for internet companies too.
Oh, thank you very much. Anne-Sophie, could you respond?
Sure. Well, there was something in John's discussion that was quite interesting to me, is this discussion about prediction algorithms, like predicting someone's status or something. And I think that's very interesting because this is often, this is research that will sort of it requires to think about privacy, but it requires to think about even some more general goals, which people are doing research and thinking about now, which includes equity and fairness and things like this. And I guess my message will touch exactly what I was saying before, is that these things are not just technical, right? So there is a lot of technical work, and people might be surprised about this, but there's a lot of technical work on trying to define fairness, trying to define equity. And so people, computer scientists and statisticians, try to think about how you can measure fairness and what it would mean in all sorts of frameworks. But what these examples, these prediction algorithms make me think of, it's also about the finality of what you want to do. And then people might not worry about privacy, but they might worry about what it is you're doing with the data, with their data, even if there is no privacy breach for their own data, or even if there's no privacy breach for anyone's data. And so I guess now it's sort of broadening a bit the discussion, but I think they really go hand in hand. Because privacy is not the only thing that people are worried about when it comes to official statistics. And we've seen a few examples. I mean, you may have seen the example recently where grades for students were predicted based on their past. So they couldn't do all the exams, and so grades were predicted based on some past information and some modeling. And in that modeling, right, there's no privacy problem necessarily, but people would still not feel comfortable sharing their information for that use, because it doesn't seem fair necessarily for everyone that grades are predicted in that way. And it turns out that it didn't work very well, and the decision was reversed. But I think this idea of bringing in fairness and equity, and it's, again, about people controlling what the data can be used for. So I think that's that we need to think about that also. And again, this requires people that are not just technical people to join in the conversation. So I guess that's what struck me most about what John was talking about, because this is something that people are looking at even without privacy constraints. And I guess on that, I would also mention that from a more technical perspective, we run into problems when we think about these prediction algorithms. Because from a technical perspective, if I want to make sure that I keep privacy there, what I would be doing is make sure that my predictions doesn't change too much depending on who's in the data set. But depending on what I'm trying to predict, if it's too easy to predict it for the population, it doesn't really matter who's in my data set or not. I'll still be predicting the right thing. And so the ability of predicting people's behavior, right, like that's almost privacy, right? Because it's like privacy of something that you haven't done yet or something, right? Like, because when the government now is able to predict, I don't know, your career choices or which school you'll apply to, now you're thinking about the privacy of things that you haven't even made decisions for yourself. So it's like privacy in the future. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but there is something that, I mean, even as a citizen, I feel I don't enjoy thinking about the fact that someone can predict my behavior. And so I think that's part of privacy. But of course, that's not exactly part of the usual privacy definition in official statistics. So that's why, things really need to move on. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to turn to Erin now.
Thank you. So does utility trump privacy? Well, yes and no. In some cases, it might be more important, not more important, but utility might be higher, which will trigger different ways of approaching privacy, or privacy might be higher, which will trigger different ways of approaching how to fulfill the needs. So one is not going to completely make the other one fade away, but it always starts with a need and a purpose, and it's not one or the other. Let me give you an example. The car makers, they know what is the most aerodynamic way of building a car. It should have the shape of a space rocket or a bullet. That's the most aerodynamic. But people want to be comfortable, so to be comfortable, it should have the shape of a cube and with big lazy boys and sofas in it. But it's not going to be one or the other because there are different needs. And so the car makers, they're trying to build different cars that respond to different needs, hauling more, being comfortable, speed, family, and all that. So while they know that they have to take both into account, there's some ways of finding solutions. And that's exactly what's happening here with needs and privacy. You don't discard one or the other. And to link to what John said, in Canada, we don't have the needs-based production of statistics exactly enshrined into the Stats Act, but Canada, as other countries, is a signatory country to the United Nations General Assembly that adopted the fundamental principles of official statistics in 2014. And there, in those 10 principles, number one principle has to do with utility and need. It's official statistics produced that meet the test of practical utility. And so in Canada, at Statistics Canada, we have explicitly adopted the scientific approach to deal with our data provision. And the scientific approach starts with a need. So there's a need to do something. We look at what's available in the literature. We look at what was done in the past, look at what are the conditions. We formulate hypotheses that we test, and then we draw some conclusions, adjust the hypotheses, and then at some point we go into production. So it is need-based from that point of view. And so if the need is high, like the census, the purpose for the census that John aptly presented. In Canada, it's similar. We need a census. It is a mandatory exercise, so we don't ask for consent. People have to fill the census. In the context of the COVID-19, well, there was a lot of information that was needed to provide to the Public Health Agency of Canada. And so we did at Statistics Canada some web scraping to gather information from different websites in order to produce that information for the health agency, because the need, the public good was clearly really high. And so we still put in place and made sure that privacy is protected, but we didn't ask for consent. What we do is we operate under a transparency model. So we have a trust center on our website. Everything we do is well posted there. We make sure to inform Canadians about how we do what we do, but depending on the need, the effort, the proportionality of the effort might change. But in some ways, the proportionality will always be there. And I cannot conceive a scenario where privacy would be completely left out because of utility. It goes hand in hand, and the level of importance of either might be shifting to the conditions, but not going away.
Okay, and Amanda, how about you?
So it's a really interesting discussion that we're having here, and I think I want to echo some things that people have said. The first is going to the idea that what we're talking about here is we're talking about sometimes really important social goods like evidence-based management of a pandemic. And we're talking about fundamental human rights, the right to privacy. And trumping when you're talking about trumping, you're talking about having winners and losers. Fundamentally, you're talking about one thing means that the other thing doesn't matter. And I think, as Eric said, I can't think of a situation where you'd want that. I can't think of a situation where you'd want even the most important social good to trump privacy. I think that this is where you have to come to necessity and proportionality. You have to say, we have to carefully make sure that privacy loss is proportional to the social benefit gained. And that needs to be a very broad discussion. And this is where privacy, some of the things that my colleagues were talking about, is we need to remember that privacy doesn't just happen after a statistical agency has information and it's about how they share it and release it. It happens when they're deciding what to collect, because people care about that. Because of all of the kinds of things that could happen, predictive analytics, or just that sense of discomfort with how much your government may know about you, even if it's with all of the best intentions. So privacy does cover the ideas of even if information isn't used in a way that has a very specific direct impact on you, but the way your personal information is used is part of your privacy, because someone was collecting that, perhaps with your consent, perhaps without your consent. Often when it comes to official statistics, it can be without consent. And then they're using it for something which may affect a group or a subgroup. And those kind of things are definitely part of privacy. And when people think about privacy and the kinds of protection and privacy that they expect, they're expecting those things as well. They're not just expecting that care be taken to ensure that they are not re-identified and that they are not directly targeted by an initiative. So you have to take that broad perspective. And again, there are tools to do this. So COVID, Eric mentioned COVID, and I think it was a really interesting example. So of course, that's something that a number of agencies were collecting data about, and we had to balance these ethics issues. And if anyone wants, I'm going to put in a plug for our website now, priv.gc.ca. If you search on there for COVID framework, you'll see that we put together some principles which come down to some of the same principles that Eric was talking about, in necessity and proportionality, to guide that. So you have to start by saying, what is the need, the public purpose that we're trying to fill? And then is it supported by empirical evidence? Can you actually see that statistics of this particular nature are going to actually support the public good there? So you have to say, what's the evidence-based connection between what we want to produce and that public good? And then you have to say what, and then you say, what do we need to collect to get at that? Is it personal information? Is it other kinds of information? How do we fill that need? And avoid collecting things that you don't need to fill that need. That's part of the equation. And then you look at proportionality and you say, okay, it feels like, and you may say, it feels like the balance isn't right here. What can we do to make this less privacy intrusive? What can we do to improve the social benefit? So those are the kinds of questions, and they are not technical questions. They are very broad-based questions, and they go to what people's expectations are, and they go to things, ethics in a broader sense. But there are tools. So the necessity and proportionality framework is a well-established international framework for looking at weighing different things, particularly privacy, in lots of different spheres. And it's something where it's going to grow in the statistics sphere. And there's a lot of room for creativity. There's a lot of room for finding ways to think about privacy in that big picture way, and to say, how can we reduce that feeling that people get, that they feel like they're being surveilled? Because that's part of privacy, is, do I feel like I'm free? Do I feel like the government is watching me? Do I not? So there's a lot in that, and we all have to sort of use our gut and think about, okay, how would someone feel about this when we're making those decisions?
Oh, thank you. Maybe before we turn to the third question, I do have a follow-up that maybe just an opinion. It's just been on my mind recently. It's a little bit related to what I see with my kids in COVID, but I think it's related to this question. So what I see with my kids in school and in their jobs and where they're living, some are in college, some are in high school, is that there's a wide variety of requirements for reporting about exposure to COVID-19. And I think there's a lot of pressures on kids in certain circumstances not to report. So I know that at my daughter's workplaces, they've said that there's employees who probably probably have been exposed to COVID-19, but are not reporting it because they need the money. And my son shares a house with some students in college who are very serious athletes, and there's a strong incentive not to report signs of exposure or illness because so much is riding on their participation in practices. So this issue of privacy can be confounded with pressures not to report. And I wonder if any of you have an opinion about that. Does that add to this, or is it included in privacy?
I was going to let others go first, but I will point out that one of the original approaches in survey methodology to protecting privacy in the situations like Don just described was called randomized response. That particular technique lies at the heart of the systems that Apple has engineered into your iPhone. Google has engineered into its COVID-19 report outs. And it's basically an attempt to protect you mathematically from risks to your personal well-being when you contribute statistics whose aggregation helps the social body politic. That is deeply complicated for COVID-19 because the statistical reporting and the best epidemiology are in public interest conflict. Contact tracing is inherently non-private and doesn't really work in a private setting. So interest balancing is again the key. If the reason that you're trying to do this is to provide good information about where people are congregating and what might be a potential hotspot, then the techniques that Apple and Google have been promulgating are very effective. If what you want to run is a proper contact tracing system, then you have to have buy-in from the population and cooperation, or it doesn't work. And mandating that cooperation is unlikely to make it come forward. You have to see the benefits in terms of keeping people safe and healthy. In Africa, when they were controlling the Ebola virus, because the outbreak was so severe, it was easier to sell the concept that contact tracing was critical to keeping your community safe. But if the severity isn't what you want, but if the severity of a COVID-19 outbreak were uniformly intense, it would be easier to sell the privacy violating contact tracing that's necessary to control it.
Maybe
Go ahead.
if I could chime in there, because the contact tracing, it's an interesting issue and one that we looked at. And I think there's always ways. So in the federal government's contact tracing app, where our office was involved in discussing the privacy impacts, and there are still a lot of things that you can do to protect privacy. So for instance, with the contact tracing app, the information, for instance, information in the app is kept on phone and only uploaded if someone does report an illness. So until that point, it's protected. So that's a sort of data collection minimization, which enhances privacy. And then there's also that if you get a flag from the COVID Alert app that you've had a contact, it won't tell you who, it'll just tell you someone, and then you can go and get tested. So there's a disclosure prevention aspect. So there are still lots of ways to respect, to balance privacy, even with something as serious as COVID, and even as something as important as contact tracing, but something like official statistics where trust and buy-in is so important, is that you have to do that, right? And there are often creative ways. It would seem at first blush like something like contact tracing, you just can't do without sharing lots of information, but it turns out that there are ways to do that. And I think one of the things at the heart of this too, at the heart of the question you raised, Dawn, is that different people have different privacy sensitivities. Now, you gave an example of maybe where someone is worried about their sports career more than protecting, you know, their fellow humans. But there could be lots of other situations where someone's reputation is more on the line if something gets revealed than something else. We can think about gender status or something like that. Many people would be very open about their gender status, but for some people that's hugely privacy intrusive. And that's where talking to people and giving people control matters, because privacy sensitivity can vary so much depending on your individual context. And so that is part of privacy, is thinking about, okay, I've thought about most people, but have I thought about this subgroup and how they would be affected?
Eric?
I was just thinking that everything we've been saying and everything we do, we take needs and public good and privacy both into account, and we try to do the best we can. But often what happens is we measure, or we try to measure something, and privacy is there as a concept, as a tool, as a consideration. But what we have not done a lot, maybe not much, is to try to measure somehow privacy, measure data sensitivity, and try to gather intelligence on what people see, feel, think, live about that, so that when we take it into account, it is much more evidence-based than what has been done. And so one of the things we're trying to do, this is just tip of the iceberg, we're trying to gather some information on data sensitivity on a few topics, looking at different pieces of information that we have in the government, and maybe also doing some focus groups to try to understand. And I think as we gather evidence more and more on the topic of privacy and sensitivity, then we can be maybe, hopefully, more effective at taking it into account more completely.
Oh, thank you. We have a question from the audience that I think is pretty interesting. Maybe it's relevant at this point, so let's turn to that. The question is basically this: how does the coordination of collection of information factor into this discussion of the balance between privacy and the needs of statistics? So I think the specific question is, in consideration of the need to collect only what is necessary for a specific application, but also with the decreasing participation rates, could you comment on the balance of multiple requests for very specific information versus fewer but more general collection of data? So I think it's something to do with being overwhelmed with requests for information.
I could launch the discussion.
Okay, sure.
This is actually part of the Statistics Act in Canada. Whatever we collect has to be for a purpose and must be used. We cannot collect something just in case. But it's beyond the Statistics Act, as was said earlier. It has to do with the social acceptability of what we do. We can try to collect very detailed information on a personal level on all kinds of things. And let me give you an extreme example of something we are not doing and we have no plan of doing. We could try to collect everything that is recorded from those Google Home and Alexa and devices at home, and try to extract from that all kinds of information that could be made into a public good. That's conceivable. That's not something that we can identify as a clear need. I mean, if we need to find information about how people work from home, we don't need to gather recordings from those devices. We can possibly run a survey, or we can probably deduce some of that information through some administrative data files, And then when we get those admin data files, do we need all the records? Do we need all the files that exist in different jurisdictions? Or do we need to just have some insight to try to better define what the need is and then go on? So there are all kinds of levels of needs and proportional efforts to gather the information. And so there is that coordination that takes place. And as Amanda and I have been saying, our agencies have been working together through a necessity and proportionality framework that we have implemented at Statistics Canada. We can make sure, well, we can better assess the proportionality of the efforts of gathering. So I hope this answers, at least in part, the question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I can just add, you talked about sort of, I think, survey fatigue, I think was a bit of the underlying idea. Like, is it better to go out and ask lots of things all at once so the person only has to deal with it once? And I think this comes to a bit of the idea. One of the things that's changing is Eric mentioned administrative data. It's a term that I wasn't familiar with before I started engaging with Statistics Canada. Is this idea that there's surveys, which is what people historically think about when they think about official statistics, but there's so much more. There's all of your tax returns, which I am here to tell you most people do not realize that the statistical offices collect. But then there's also all kinds of other sources of administrative data. So for instance, in the case of Statistics Canada, when we first got involved was when they were collecting information from our credit reporting agencies and looking at collecting information from banks. So huge data sets. And this has the benefit of reducing that fatigue on individuals. But the downside from a privacy perspective is that there's potentially a lot that's collected and without knowledge and with far less control of individuals. And those are things that you have to very carefully balance. Is that even though that does reduce the level of effort for people, they may not see it the same way. And transparency is so key. And one thing I can say is that we received an unprecedented number of complaints about these two Statistics Canada programs when they came to light for something that hadn't directly affected people, if you could put it that way. And I think this just goes that people care about what's collected and how it's collected. And ease is a factor for them, but it's certainly far from the only factor.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. There's a little interruption here. Does anyone else have anything to say? Well, I thank the audience for that question. And I apologize to the audience. There was a little mix up in the order of the slides, but I think we could share the screen to go to focus question number 3 in the time we have remaining, because I really want to get to this question. We have a little bit, we'll probably go to about 4 minutes of response now, just to warn the panel. So the question is, several disclosure protection methods rely on mathematical concepts and complex algorithms. How can one translate these into understandable public statements? And perhaps we could also mention, if you go into it, in our pre-discussion, we raised this, how we communicate uncertainty in results as part of this question. All right. I'd like to go with Eric to start.
Okay, thank you. So, well, as I said earlier, we have a policy on informing users of data quality and methodology, but it's beyond that. I think with the diversity of needs that have been expressed and the diversity of types of data sources, recent experience has shown that as statistical agencies, we need to up our game in informing the public, informing users. We have always informed users of the quality and precisions. We are providing notes, documents, links to methodology papers and all that. We have been doing that. But one thing that we have done recently, last year, is to create a trust center on our on Statistics Canada's internet page, where before we gather any information, the intent is posted, and there's time for people to react. And then how we do it, if it's with admin data or survey, this is informed. And when we come to the other end in terms of dissemination, for example, recently we introduced a new perturbation method that instead of suppressing some cells that we don't want to publish, we slightly alter the estimates. It's called random tabular adjustments. It satisfies some constraints so that the totals are maintained within some variations that is estimated and controlled. So this is a place where we provide precision measures on the estimates, and we've written documentation and papers and notes to the user on that method that adds a little bit of noise to some of the estimates to prevent disclosure. And so the precision estimates are presented, but explain that they were, as a result of the method to protect confidentiality, some of these precisions are extended a little bit. So this is some of the ways we inform on the precision.
Ah, okay. Amanda, I'd like to go to you next.
So I don't have a lot to add on how to explain statistical methodology, but I just wanted to highlight the importance of transparency generally, and the importance of explaining things in lay language. And don't forget to talk about privacy. Don't forget to talk about why you're doing the things that you're doing and how that contributes to social goods, because that's part of explaining things in a way that works. Because of course, all of the users of the data are also the subjects of the data. And the more ways you can find to explain things in lay terms, the better is going to be, because of course you have people who are savvy statisticians who are using the data, but you also have public policy makers. And there's a wide range of different understanding about what's behind statistics and how they may or may not be suitable to a particular task. So I think I'll just leave it there with a pitch for it's always good to try to be as transparent as possible about all of the things that affected what you did with the project.
Oh, thank you. Anne-Sophie, do you have some comments?
Yes. So I think that's a very difficult question. And one of the very nice effects of the decision for the Census Bureau to start using differential privacy, I think, is it really increased the interest in people in what is this? What are statistical disclosure limitations? How does it affect my data? What do I need to do about this? Because it's been done for a really long time. And as Eric was mentioning, it's very clearly detailed in a lot of documentation in the statistical agency's websites. So whenever I teach statistics to students, I try to bring them to Statistics Canada website so that they see, what data is available. And we go through looking not just at the data, but the very detailed description of how the data was collected and the measures that he was describing of the quality of the data and what has been done. But the issue is that the past statistical disclosure limitation methods, a lot of them were based on not revealing what they were. So for example, when you do swapping, you could be informed that there has been some swapping. So there was some variables that were moved around in the data set. I won't go into detail about how, but there were some values that were disturbed in the data set, but you couldn't say exactly how, because that would reduce the use of your privacy disclosure limitation method. With differential privacy, which is now being used by the Census Bureau, what's great is you can actually really describe exactly what was done. So at least you can have this discussion a little more clearly, and people sort of start realizing, perhaps for the first time for some people, that there is something that's done to the statistic before it's public. Even if there was some before, but people sometimes didn't really understand what. And so I think that actually being clearer about exactly, more transparent about exactly what you are doing, it really helps to inform people. And so these ideas, they are difficult. Like even for a statistician, I'm trained as a statistician, that's what I do. And even for me, understanding the impact of some of these statistical disclosure methods on statistical analyses that I want to do with the data, it's difficult. In some cases, sometimes it's not, but in some cases it's quite difficult to understand. And so the need is really to have more training in general about data, about reasoning with data, about all sorts of sources of uncertainty in the data. It's not just for privacy, but there's sampling in a lot of cases, and there's non-response, and there's people that maybe not tell the truth. And so it's this general, but in practice, it is quite complicated. But I think that at least with the Census Bureau's recent move, I mean, I'm not sure that differential privacy was necessarily my preferred method of protecting the data, but it has the great utility that we can actually discuss very clearly what is being done with examples, with the small tables. And so I think that it's really in that fashion that we'll be able to help people. You really have to provide specific examples, detailed information about how privacy was protected in that way.
Well, thank you. And that's a perfect lead-in to you, John.
We have had a very interesting discussion on this subject, and I think we've hit on all the major points. It is difficult to communicate the technical underpinnings of a lot of what we do, just like it's very difficult to communicate the technical underpinnings of many AI, artificial intelligence models. And that is a challenge. It's one that we need to step up to. And the polling industry is staring at that challenge right now, having taught users that the margins of error matter, and you almost never see a polling number reported without a margin of error. The Census Bureau has taught users that margins of error matter, and you don't see any of our sample-based summaries reported without margins of error. But that doesn't communicate what you should think about, and it doesn't necessarily communicate that the margin of error might not contain all the information you need to sensibly use the statistic. So I think one of the best things that the Census Bureau did was hire Henry Reich, or collaborate with Henry Reich, who is the physicist who does Minute Physics. And he put out a 10-minute video in his Minute Physics style explaining reconstruction-based re-identification attacks and differential privacy's defenses against them in language that technically sophisticated people could understand without having to be experts in it. If you don't know about Minute Physics, he did the same thing for relativity, and he has a series of 10 lectures on relativity of about the same length each that explain the major concepts in it. And I'm not a physicist by training. I'm able to understand the concepts there. And I believe that people can understand the concept of a reconstruction attack and how differential privacy protects against it, re-identification from that video. But that, that is aimed at an incredibly high level of sophistication. There's something like 500,000 people have seen that video, which is better exposure, I'm sure, than the census.gov website explaining what we have done, but it's directed at a very technical audience. Explaining it to congressional staff, which I've tried to do, explaining it to demographers, which I've been challenged to do many times, is a lot more difficult. If your discipline isn't used to thinking about the uncertainty that comes from confidentiality protection, starting to do that is opening up a whole new set of questions you have to ask yourself. That's true, and it's very transparent, but it's not immediately obvious what you should do in every case. And so we have been trying to write in helpful techniques about what you should do and trying to control the situations where it's just not going to be possible to accommodate the analysis to the uncertainty. So you want to control the uncertainty in those use cases a lot more, but that limits the number of statistics that you can do that to. Every statistic can't have perfect precision. That's basically the mathematical theorem that started out this discussion, and communicating that to diverse audiences can be very challenging.
Yes, thank you. That the challenge of communicating the meaning of uncertainty and how to factor it into your decision and policy making is certainly a challenge that it goes across all statistics, at least. And of course, we have it in all kinds of contexts, in engineering and science, and of course also in privacy related issues. We have not very much time. I have a question that's really circling back to question one. I'm not sure how many people will get a chance to speak to this. And it's related also to the discussion about conveying the meaning of statistics and uncertainty. Do you all have an opinion about to what extent statisticians and agencies involved with statistics have a voice in the construction of legislation that have to do with privacy and collection of statistics? Is there a way that that could be strengthened, that sort of interaction? For example, if you think of laws that have to do with, say, in the environment, there'll be very public open sessions that involve getting communications from different stakeholders into the legislation before it's really drafted. So I guess I'm asking, is there such a thing to do with privacy and collecting of statistics? Eric?
Thank you. National statistical offices, we are not policy departments, so it is not our role to try to come up with policies, but we need to be at the tables of discussion early on so that we are aware collectively as the agency as to what are the policies that are being developed, what are the government's priorities, so that we make sure that we gather the information that is needed to inform the policymakers and the decision makers. I would be very disappointed if decisions were made in absence of information that was needed because we weren't able to provide it. So we want to make sure that, we want to the greatest extent, make available the information that is needed for policy making to take place in a very informed way. And so that comes back to the need. If this is a need that is expressed clearly, then utility, proportionality, privacy, all that comes into play. And so the challenge here is to try to inform before the need is fully expressed. And so that is a challenge of trying to reuse the information we have versus collecting some more. And so it gets us back to the same issues as we've been discussing during the last 90 minutes.
Sure, Amanda.
And I just say, I think the question was about design of statistics legislation, I think. And I think whenever you're designing legislation, you need to think really carefully about which subject matter expertise you consult. And it absolutely has to be domain specific subject matter expertise. And it absolutely has to be specialists like privacy, like other things that impinge on that. And I think that's the way you get high quality legislation, is by making sure that all perspectives are represented at the table.
Yeah, and I think that puts some kind of responsibility on the statistics and mathematical communities to try to do a better job of trying to explain what their methods do, how they function, and uncertainties related to them. In some sense, that's part of the mission of the Institute program that funds things like CANSI. Well, so we're closing in now. I want to thank the audience, first of all, for participating and listening to us. And I'd really like to thank the panelists for just an excellent discussion. And it was fun listening to the preparation for this panel and listening to the panel itself. So I want to thank John Abowd and Anne-Sophie Charest and Amanda Edmunds and Eric Rancourt. Thank you. Oh, and I should say, I booth for the next half hour. I can't really say much about privacy and official statistics, but I can talk about CANSI and other kinds of statistics research.